Godspeed to all of you. I am Pastor Alvin B. Thomas, pastor of St. Mark Reformed Zion Union Apostolic Church. I'm here to present the church Bible study for April the 1st, 2020. The first category is our previous quiz question, which was, who spoke that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils? And our answer is found in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, which provides that now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. So the answer is the Holy Spirit. Category 2 is the new quiz question for the next time. That question is, what color did famine cause the children of Israel's skin to be? What color did famine cause the children of Israel's skin to be? That's for the next time we come together. Category 3, did you know this about the early church? And we're speaking again in the line of James' epistle, part 4. The book of James is so much more because it stresses not just faith, but faith in practice. The trying of your faith works patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that gives to all men liberally and upbraids not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavers is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Listen to what James says about the rich man and the poor man. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but let the rich in that he is made low, because as the flower of the grass he shall pass away. For the sun is no sooner risen with a burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falls, and the grace of the fashion of it perishes. So also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. Hearken, my beloved brethren, has not God chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to them that love him? But you have despised the poor. Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seats? Do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called? Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries, that ye shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rest of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. You have heaped treasures together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you, kept back by fraud, cries, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived in pleasure on the earth and have been wanton. You have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed the just, and he does not resist you. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. And behold, the husbandman waits for the precious fruit of the earth, and has long patience for it. until it receives the early and the latter rain. Category 4, the study of the book of Joshua. We finished up chapter 22. We began a new chapter in chapter 23. In this and the following chapter, we have two farewell sermons which Joshua preached to the people of Israel a little before his death. I had the design to gratify the curiosity of succeeding ages. He would rather have recorded the method of Israel's settlement and their new conquest, their husbandry, their manufacturers, their trade, custom courts of justice, and the constitution of their infant commonwealth, which one would wish to be informed of. But that which he intended in the registers of this book was to entail posterity a sense of religion and their duty to God. And therefore, overlooking these other things which are the usual subjects of a common history, he here transmits to his reader the methods he took to persuade Israel to be faithful to their covenant with their God, which might have a good influence on the generations to come, who should read those reasonings, as we may hope they had on the generation which then heard them. In this chapter, chapter 23, we have a convention of all the states, which is called, and Joshua's speech reminding the tribes of what God had done for them, encouraging them to persevere in their duty and what he was ready to do henceforth. That's found in Joshua chapter 23, verses 1 through 10. 1. No mention at all is made of the place where the General Assembly was held. Some think it was in Timnath-Serah, Joshua's own city, where he lived and whence, being old, he could not well remove. But it does not appear that he took so much state upon him. Therefore, it is more probable that this meeting was held in Shiloh. There the tabernacle of meeting was, and to which place perhaps all the males that could have come up to the worship before the Lord at one of these three great feasts, which Joshua took the opportunity of for the delivering of this charge to them. 2. There is only a general mention of the time when this was done. It was long after the Lord had given them rest, but it is not said how long. Verse 1 says, it was so long as that Israel had time to feel the comforts of their rest from war and the possessions in Canaan, and to enjoy the advantages of the good land. 2. It was so long as that Joshua had time to observe which ways their danger lay of being corrupted, namely by their intimacy with the Canaanites that remain against, which he is therefore careful to arm them. 3. The persons to whom Joshua made this speech, he made it to all Israel, even their elders and etc. So it might be read, verse 2, they could not all come within the hearing, but he called for all the elders, that is, the private counselors, which in later time constituted the great Sanhedrin, the head of the tribes, that is, the noblemen, and the gentlemen of their respective countries, the judges learned in what God wanted them to know about his laws, that tried criminal cases and causes and gave judgment upon them. And lastly, the officers or the sheriffs who were entrusted with the execution of those judgments. These Joshua called together, and to them he addressed himself. 1. That they might communicate what he said, or at least the sense and substance of it, to those under them in their respective countries. And so this charge might be dispersed through the whole nation of Israel. 2. Because if they would be prevailed upon to serve God and to cleave to him, they, by their influence on the common people, would keep them faithful. If great men be good men, they will help make many good. 4. Joshua's circumstances when he gave them this charge. He was old and stricken in age. Probably it was in the last year of his life, and he lived to be 110 years old, as recorded in chapter 24, verse 29 of Joshua. And he himself takes notice of it. In the first words of his discourse, verse 2, when he began to be old, some years ago, God reminded him of it in chapter 13, verse 1 of Joshua. It says, "Thou art old," coming from God. But now he did it himself, feel so much of the decays of age that he needed not to be told of it. He readily speaks of it himself. He says, "I am old and stricken in age." He uses it, one, as an argument with himself to give them this charge. Because being old, he could expect to be but a little while with them and to advise and instruct them. And therefore, as Peter speaks in 2 Peter 1 and 13, he says, as long as he is in this tabernacle, meaning his body, he will take all opportunities to put them in remembrance of their duty, knowing by the increasing infirmities of age that he must shortly put off this tabernacle, and desiring that after his decease they may continue as good as they were now. And when we see death hastening towards us, this should quicken us to do the work of life with all our might. 2. As an argument with them to give heed to what he said. He was old and experienced, and therefore to be the more regarded, for the days should speak. He had grown old in their service and had spent himself for their good, and therefore was to be the more regarded by them. He was old and dying. They would not have him long to preach to them, and therefore let them observe what he said now, and lay it up in store for the time to come. And 5, the discourse itself, the scope of which it is to be engaged with them, if possible, them and their seed after them, to persevere in the true faith and worship of the God of Israel. 1, he puts them in mind of the great things God had done for them. Now in his days and under his administration, for here he goes no further back, and for the proof of this, he appeals to their own eyes in verse 3. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done. Not what I have done or what you have done. We were only instruments in God's hand, but what God himself has done by me and by you. Many great and mighty nations, as the rate of nations then went, were driven out from as fine a country as any was at the time upon the face of this earth, to make room for Israel. You see, what he has done to these nations, who were his creatures, the work of his hands, and whom he could have made new creatures and fit for his service, yet see what destruction he has made of them because of you, how he has driven them out from before you, as noted in verse 9, as if they were of no account with him, though great and strong in comparison with you. They were not only driven out, but they were trodden down before them. Though they held out against them with the greatest obstinacy that could be, yet they were subdued before them. which made the possession of their land so much more glorious to Israel, and so much the more illustrious an instance of the power and the goodness of God and for Israel. The Lord your God has not only led you and fed you and kept you, but he has fought for you as a man of war, by which the title he was known among them when he first brought them out of Egypt. Exodus 15:3 tells us this. And so clear and cheap were all their victories during the course of this long war that no man had been able to stand before Israel. That is, to make heed against them, so as to put them in fear, to create them any difficulty or give them any check to their progress of their victories of arms. Never was an army crowned with such a constant, uninterrupted series of successes as the army of Israel were in the wars of Canaan. They had not only conquered the Canaanites, but were put in full possession of their land. I have divided to you by lot these nations, both those which are cut off and those which remain. Not only that, you may have their spoil and plunder, and live at destruction in their country for a time, but to be assured and lasting inheritance for your tribes. You have it not only under your feet, but you have it in your hands. He assures them of God's readiness to carry on to complete this glorious work in due time. It is true that some of the Canaanites did yet remain in Canaan, and some places were strong and daring, but this should be no disappointment to their expectation, which Israel was so multiplied as to be able to replenish this land. God would expect the Canaanite to the last man, provided Israel would pursue their advantages and carry on the war against them with vigor. The Lord your God will drive them from out of your sight, so that there shall not be a Canaanite to be seen in the promised land. And even that part of the country which is yet in their hand, you shall possess. Joshua tells them what little need they had to be in care about the numbers of their forces. That's found in verse 10. 1 man of you shall chase 1,000, and Jonathan did. 1 Samuel 14:3. Each tribe may venture for itself and for the recovery of his own lot, without fearing any disadvantage by the disproportion of the numbers. For the Lord your God, whose all power is, both to in spirit and to this spirit, and who has all the creatures at his back, he is he that fighteth for you. And how many do you reckon him for? He hereupon most earnestly charges them to adhere to their duty, to go and persevere in the good ways of the Lord, wherein they had so well set out. He exhorts them to be very courageous. In verse 6, God fighteth for you against your enemy. Do you therefore behave yourselves valiantly for him? Keep and do with a firm resolution all that is written in the book of the law. He presses upon them no more than what they were already bound to. Keep with care, do with diligence, what is written with sincerity. To be very cautious, take heed of missing it, either on the right hand or on the left, for there are errors and extremes on both hands. Take heed of running either into a profane neglect of any of God's institutions, or into a superstitious addition of any of your own inventions. They must especially take heed of all approaches towards the idolatry, the sin so which they were first inclined and would be most tempted. That's presented in verse 7. To be very constant, Joshua tells them in verse 8, cleave unto the Lord your God. That is, delight in him. Depend upon him. Devote yourselves to his glory and continue to do so to the end, as you have done unto this day, ever since you came to Canaan, the promised land, for being willing to make the best of them. Go on and prosper, for the Lord is with you while you are with him. Those that command should commend. The way to make people better is to make the best of them. You have cleaved to the Lord unto this day. Therefore, go on and do so, else you lose the praise and the recompense of what you have wrought. Your righteousness will not be mentioned unto you if you turn from it. Next time we come together, we will be looking at Joshua chapter 23, verses 11 through 16, where Joshua gives the children of Israel fair warning of the consequences of idolatry. Our memory verse for this week, number 8, is Luke chapter 4, verse 2. Being 40 days tempted of the devil, and in those days he did eat nothing, and when they were ended, he afterward hungered. The cutting-edge wisdom nugget is God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supplies. Hudson Taylor. That concludes the Bible study for this week. I remain yours in Christ, and I bid you all a hearty Godspeed.